Mom, or we're the ones that started the antiques? This is the time, right here. Okay, Georgiann, would you like to take over?
I misconceived of what I was going to talk about tonight, talking about antiques. I talk about that every day, so it's just kind of something that I thought I'd talk about me in Crete, putting me and my family in Crete, in the house. This is now my shop. But this was the house that I grew up in, that I lived in all my life. And I'm back home again. And my name is Georgiann Sharp Timmerman. And I've lived in Crete all my life. But 9 years ago, I made the big move and moved 13 miles to Frankfurt. But I still come here and spend a lot more time here than I ever do in Frankfurt. Having a business, you just spend all your time here. After I accepted to do the talk, I'm going to tell you about me and my family in Crete. And I was wondering how I could fit into the historical feeling of Crete. And then I realized this year I'll be 50. And that's pretty historical. Yeah, I know it seems hard to believe. And being 50 in Crete and still being here, I guess, is pretty historical in the house that I grew up in. And remembering a lot of things that have gone on seem like and are gone forever. And hearing you talk about the picture of the Rowe drugstore, I still remember walking by, having that smell come out at you. And seeing Mrs. Rowe look at you with her piercing eyes and wondering if you had just taken something. And being scared, and the smell just comes back every time you're uptown. And wondering about the Wilkening building and having it being scary and having to walk around the block so you didn't have to go right next to it. The old hotel by the park with its many unsavory residents, not allowed to go near. Cushman's, they made the best milkshakes in town, and that stool seemed so high. Well, having the antique shop in the same house I grew up is like coming home every day. And I guess I'm really lucky to feel that feeling, feel at home in a town like Crete, and making them feel at home in my house, because it is my house. And we have a couple stories that we tell about our house. One of them being, if you've ever been in and tried to go upstairs in the house, and the stairs are very, very small. And my father, having a size 12 foot, every time he'd go upstairs, he'd come back down in the morning and he'd say, I've got to do something about this stairway. And being a real do-it-yourselfer, my mom would say, when you figure out how to make it, how to change it, then you can change it, but you're not tearing it apart until you do that. Well, the stairway still is intact, as it was. He never figured it out. The other story that just recently I retiled the kitchen floor, and I know it was hard to imagine that it needed it again, but we figured the tile was put down in 1951. So I put down new tile on the floor. And again, one of those projects that my dad was going to tackle, and he said to my mom, as long as you don't mind cooking on a hot plate for probably a week, we're going to tear up the kitchen floor. And some of you who have redone old houses can live with this. 4 months later, we had a kitchen floor. And there's this little hump in the floor. That's how it all started. My dad wanted to fix the little hump. And if you come into the shop, you'll see the little hump is still in place. Well, as the story goes, my father moved into the house. He and his family moved into the house in probably around 1917. They moved from Chicago Heights. My grandfather, John, and my grandmother, Elizabeth, moved with their 2 children, Dorothy and George. And my dad was just a couple years old at the time. They moved into a real nice little house on 5th Street. And basically at that time it was pretty well like on the edge of town. I mean, it wasn't, they had chicken coops out in the back and everything else. And the story goes that it was a one-room schoolhouse that was moved there, and then the front part of the house was added on. And as my dad said, when he moved into it, the only thing he can remember is the house was really old, and it was always old. And it's had a lot of remodeling over the years. But, so, I mean, it's just home, you know. And just to tell you that we are a family of savers. And I mean, we are savers. I use my great-great-grandmother's dresser every day. And it was brought out when they moved from Indiana. When they moved to Indiana from Ohio, just after the Civil War, it was brought out inside with a covered wagon. So, I mean, every day I pull those drawers out that might not roll just exactly how you think of drawers rolling out, but it's never bothered me because just think of all the people up in our family that have used that dresser, and here I'm lucky enough to still have it. Well, we have over in our family room, we have the picture of my great-great-grandfather's discharge from the Civil War. And to think that our family saved this kind of stuff, and we were lucky enough to have gotten it. We had a great aunt, my father had a great aunt, who instilled in us the love of old things. To think that our family saved all this stuff for hundreds of years, and that we're lucky enough to live with it every day. And she moved in with us probably in the 60s, well actually it was like 59, and that really kind of pushed us out of the house on 5th Street. Then my parents built a new house, but she instilled the love of old things in us beyond. She was almost blind when we started taking care of her in her home in Indiana. She ended up, when she moved in with us, was completely blind, but you could give her a hand or anything and she could tell you what it was, because she had grown up with this stuff. And my sister has a pie safe, the same thing, that's got the pierced tin, and think of how many pies that they stored in this over the years. And that we were just lucky enough to be a family that got all this stuff. And here we are, lucky to be in a, you know, in a house that we grew up in. But like I say, I haven't been real good at getting rid of things either. I still have my prom dress in the basement. I don't know if any of you remember me, but when I was 16 years old, my dad gave me an idea what kind of car I wanted, and I told him I wanted a Model A Roadster. Well, I still have it today. But I just want you to know that when I graduated from high school in 1963 from Crete High School, I got a new set of white wall tires. And I am thinking I'm going to have to replace them. They're getting dry rot. Things just aren't made the way they used to be. So just to go back and, you know, in our history a little bit, that we moved into the house. I mean, my dad moved into the house. They lived in the house. I mean, I was born in 1945. My sister was born in 1942. And there's one little story that goes back before we were born. My dad was probably about 10 years old, and his mother passed away, had pneumonia and died. And I have an uncle, every time he walks into the house, he walks into the front room, and he's by the front bay window, and he says, "I can still see your Grandma Lizzie laid out in the casket there." And I'm like, "Do you have to tell me that every time you come over, you know?" And he says, "Yeah, but he says, it's just like walking back in time." He says, "I can just still see her laid out in that sunshine coming in." So it's just kind of progressed. My Aunt Becky, who is my dad's younger sister, was born in the house. She was born in the downstairs bedroom. We weren't born in the house. We were born in a hospital. By the time we came along, we were in a hospital. progressed to that point. I guess things are progressing back again, but we were born in the hospital, but came to the house that we call home. And if you ever go upstairs in the old house, you'll see the little room where my sister and I, it was our room. Our grandfather had built this beds in, we had drawers under the beds. We never thought the room was small. You look at it and think how 2 kids grew up in a room this size. I was 11 and my sister was 13 when we moved out of the house. So, and I mean, we've never been really little kids. My mom will say sometimes, she'll say, you know, I remember taking the club upstairs to see this closet upstairs. She said, I was so proud I finally got a closet. She said, it's varnished plywood. But she said, I was so thrilled to finally have a closet in this old house. And she says, I look at it now and I think, I took people upstairs to see this closet, you know. But varnished plywood works, you know. So we grew up in the house. The gas station, which has been, gas station is a real relative term if you aren't real familiar with Crete. It has been an antique shop for many years, has been through a stage of many things, but that was my grandfather's gas station. My grandfather started there with 1 pump and an outside pit to change the oil in. Well, my father actually never did really go much to high school. He decided that business was really his thing, and he took over the gas station. And finally got to be a 2-pump gas station and an outside lift. That was big time. And over the years, my dad just kept building onto the gas station, and finally he had 2 bays and 4 pumps. That was big, that was big. And after the war, they decided that things were changing, things were moving, that they were going to be right up and coming. They were going to build out a showroom, and they were getting the Kaiser Fraser dealership. Well, my dad got the first car. He decided it wasn't up to his specifications, and I hope none of you bought the car. And he decided that that was it. He turned the dealership in, and they had to do something with this nice big addition they put on, so they went into the appliance business. Well, in the 50s, things were changing for my parents. My father was a severe diabetic, so he really always worked too hard, too fast, the whole thing. Decided that the gas station business was just too busy for him. They leased the station out to Art Cragel. It became Art's Texaco. But that didn't stop my dad from planning or doing. And what I call, and I know the house belonged to someone, but in our growing up, we called it the Massarelli Asparagus Farm. Came up on tax auction or mortgage foreclosure auction. My dad bought the place and decided that he was going to open a junk shop, junkyard in particular. And my mother said, oh, no, you're not. You have 2 daughters. No way, no way. They're not going to be in the junk business. So he said, well, he bought this place. What was he going to do with it? Maybe he'd go into used furniture. He didn't know anything about used furniture, but maybe it would sell. He didn't know. So he decided to open a shop. My mom said that would fit into the criteria, but not a junkyard, not old cars and, you know. So he opened up the first Sharp's swap shop. And really, as far as the world of antiques, I don't know that we knew about them. I don't know. I mean, we had this great aunt who would help us, tell us about things, but knowing that this was an antique, all we could tell you it was good furniture, you know. So my dad started going out and buying, and people would just line up to buy this stuff. I mean, in those days, just to tell you that there was a whole enclosed porch on the front. My dad would have at least 25 or 30 round oak tables, and it was your choice, $25. Well, if you've been out shopping at all today, they have gone up a little bit in price, if you can find one. So my dad thought this was a pretty good business. He could go out and buy. He loved to buy. I have taken after him quite well in that respect. And my mother loved to sell, so it worked. It was a very good, she'd stay in the shop, he'd go out and buy. And, I mean, they were business people, but you had to fit into their criteria. My father never bargained at a price. He set the price on it. That was it. It was the same to everybody who walked in the door. And people would say, well, he'd throw them out if they really gave him a hard time. He didn't care. At noon every day, they closed the shop from 12 to 1. They went home and ate lunch. If there were people in the shop, they'd have to leave. They'd have picnics out on the lawn. But that was it. He'd close the doors at 12 o'clock and go home and eat lunch. So business was getting pretty good. And of course, my father gets bored with things because he likes big projects. So the next big project that I'm real familiar with is he bought the marketplace, the old Congregational Church. And I mean, it was not a Congregational church when we bought it. The congregation had a much nicer church in Stager, a waning membership. They decided to go to the Stager church. This church was sold to the Baptists. Well, the church hadn't been kept up by the Baptists real well. And then the fires took a toll. They had old stove heat in it. And sometimes if they'd go light it and it wouldn't light or whatever, all of a sudden, the hotel in Crete, when it finally burned down, he said, well, I guess they beat me on, because he could never get zoning to do something with it. Well, here he buys the church figuring, I mean, it is zoned residential, but I mean, churches, it's next to a cemetery and a railroad track. It'd make a beautiful shop. Well, going back in time again, the village decided that maybe my father was going to open a gas station there.
Yeah.
So they weren't going to zone a business for him. He never had any intention of opening a gas station. He was going to make an antique shop out of it. Well, he restored the building. He even offered it to him, which will really bother if he restored the building, they zoned it business. When he got done, or a period of, it was, I don't know, there was a period of time, he would donate it back to them for what it cost to be remodeled. He paid $15,000 for the building, okay? It cost him about $12,000, so he would use it till he was done. He would donate it back to them if they would zone a business for him. Well, they didn't want any part of that. So, in order, they wrote a new ordinance because they didn't want to zone a business that antique shops could be run in old churches and old schools. So, he opened it as an antique shop. Now, they still have the Massarelli house. They decided to break up the business, open the antique shop in the church, keep that as the used furniture business. Well, that worked for a while. I was still in high school at the time, but then as I got married, I have kids, it's very difficult to keep two shops going. In the meantime comes this middle piece of property, which is now the Crete Funeral Home, or as we refer to it, and have always referred to it, as the Wilkening House. Because growing up on 5th Street with the Wilkenings there, even though we owned the house for probably almost 30 years, it was always called the Wilkening House. We were always going home to the Wilkening House or going to the Wilkening House. It was never our house. That came up for sale. My father owned on 3 sides of it, had always wanted to buy it because over here was his original gas station, which he really always needed a little bit more property, especially if they like put hedges on the side. So they said what they wanted. My dad said, okay, I'm buying it. Then he still has the antique shop, used furniture. He decided that after renting that building out for a couple of years, he'd make the big house into the antique shop. Antiques were still, he was learning a lot about them. He knew a lot about antiques. You could sell them for good money. And he loved to buy, so there he is. Now, this house over here, he decided he's going to build a new gas station. He always wanted a new gas station. He hadn't run the station in years, but he wanted glazed tile on the inside. He could just hose down. he wanted a heated driveway. He put heating elements in the driveway. It never did work real well, but he tried it. So that he didn't even have to shovel it off. Of course, if we ever knew what was going to happen to gas stations now it's Crete Auto Sales. But it's a really nice building. It's going to stand up for a long time. Going back a little bit, antique business being what it was, you bought a lot of things. And I mean, a lot of them never sold real well. Some of them, but like when he bought a convent out and he had 52 iron beds, no one bought that kind of stuff. So when he built a new gas station over there, he used them as reinforcement in the concrete. So someday, if someone tears down that gas station, you see them pulling up iron beds, you'll know. And then going back into, there was a cistern over there, big cistern. And my father loved to fill it up. He thought maybe someday he would fill it up. He never did. But he'd go through the shop, I mean, stuff that, you know, like depression glass, nobody bought that stuff, but every estate that he'd buy would have all this stuff. So he'd go through the shelves and he'd say, if it doesn't sell for 50 cents, and he loved the sound of breaking glass as he'd drop it down the cistern. And we laugh now because we're selling that stuff for big bucks. And my dad dropped it down the cistern. So we have seen a lot of progression over the years in the antique business, per se. Well, we'll get back to, they have two businesses. They bought the Wilkening house. They sell the marketplace, which becomes the marketplace, to Mimi Fairchild, Betty Dunlap, and Kathy Dawn. They open it as the marketplace. They're the ones that moved the depot and put the addition on, and have done a very nice job to it. You know, they kept it up for years. They then sold it, which, by the way, always bothers me about the bell when I hear about the bell. Those things were written into the deed that they never be sold from the building. The chandeliers, which are in somebody's house up in Barrington. The bell, which should have never been sold. I mean, it should have been given to you. It shouldn't have been sold to you. But, you know, unfortunately, the people who still own, who still have title to it, selling it on contract, have never wanted to do anything about these things that have been taken away from the building. My dad tried to preserve them in the deed. It obviously didn't work. But he tried. So now he opens that, he opens the gas station. In the meantime, my husband and I, going back a little bit, 1963, we get married. I married my husband, Jim Timmerman, who I'd gone with since I was 15 years old. We live in a little apartment next door. Again, it's something that my dad moved, another house that my dad moved one time, made into an apartment building. I can remember my sister and I, in our wagon, we could carry 2 cement blocks in the wagon. And my dad laid the foundation. He got down, he said, I don't know what's wrong. He said, it's not straight. And you know, my mom's going, why didn't you hire someone to do this? He goes over and he says, I'll fix it. He pushes his feet. He pushes his feet a couple places. He said, it's straight now. It's still standing. But we then moved back into the house where I had my shop. 1964, we have 1 child. We moved back into the shop. We lived in that house for 8 years. So all of my kids think of that as home too. 8 years in the house. Now we're going to make our first big move. My sister and her husband have bought a big house on Exchange Street. They're getting transferred to Florida. We're going to buy this big old house that they bought, which we always refer to as the Jones house. The 12-room Victorian on Exchange Street that's painted gray now with the carriage house sitting out in back. So, and my husband, he hadn't even seen the house. I mean, he hadn't seen it in the original state. He only saw it. We wouldn't even, when my parents, going back a little bit, my parents bought it from the Joneses. They were going to move into it. My mom gets arthritis, decides she doesn't want it. My sister and her husband, but we won't even take our family there, and take our husbands in particular, until we tear off all this stuff off the bath and tear off the summer kitchens, and because that part that just sort of, my sister and her husband moved into the house. They live in the house for 7 years. The first couple were a little tricky. The one time that I remember in particular, my dad said, we have to have a new basement under it. We can't live with this basement. They're living in the house. They get the house mover in, shores up the foundation, but the bulldozer underneath the house with the soot coming up through the house. And my sister says, we're moving out, Dad. Find us someplace to live till you get this done. So they moved out for about a month while the new foundation went in. So my sister and her husband moved, we moved into the house. They had done a lot of the really ugly work. The basement, the addition with the bathroom on the main floor. New, like little things like a nice furnace that heated the whole house. We moved into the house and kind of, I guess, add the glitz to the house. We added carpeting and paint and a lot of those kind of things. And the carriage house. That was a little bit of a problem. If you ever remember before, I guess it was just an old barn, but we call it a carriage house now, because it kept moving backwards. One year it moved about 1.5 feet. We decided that we better do something. And my father, being a wonderful house mover, he got it up on jacks. We got it on rollers. We started moving forward. Well, we got about 1 foot and it started going back. My dad says, this is the place it's going to be. Even though it's over the lot line just a little bit by now. So we cut off the bottom 8 feet of it, put a whole new foundation on. In the meantime, they're tearing down the old Lincoln Show. So we go up and get bricks from the old Lincoln Show. That's the front of the house. That's the front of the carriage house, our bricks from the old Lincoln Show. And I mean, to say that we are savers is just going beyond. But we lived in that house for 8 years. I've been in business. My parents have gone on the edge of going out of business at this point in the big house. The church calls me and says, we're going to tear down the house over here. We wanted to know if you wanted to come look. The stairway is gorgeous in the house, and there's a beautiful leaded glass window. I said, sure, I'll come look. And I said to my husband, I said, you're going to go with me? And he says, oh, I'll go. And he said, how do you take a stairway out of a house and sell it? And he says, well, I don't know. He said, if nothing else, you could sell the banister, I'm sure. So we go into the house, and they take us through the house. And I just came out shaking my head and going, you can't tear down the house. You can't tear down the house. It's too beautiful a house. Well, I think I said that enough times that kind of got into my husband's head what I was thinking. And probably by the end of the week, I convinced him that we should move the house. Well, he agreed, I guess. As long as I did it, he agreed to it. So we made plans to take the house. We gave the church $1,000 for the house, which at that point it was going to cost them about $7,000 to have the house torn down. So we moved the house down the street onto the corner of Main and Milburn. Worked a few years before we ever lived in the house. And when I hear those words like heating and plumbing and walls, and it just brings back a lot of memories. I mean, we didn't live in the house for 2.5 years, and completely gutted, took every piece of plaster out. Because the church, owning the house for as many years as it did, churches don't spend a lot of money on houses. And as they put that fresh coat of paint over it, texture paint of course, they would fill in all those little gaps in all the beautiful old woodwork. So now we have texture painted woodwork along with texture painted walls that match. So we did a lot of work on the house before we ever moved into the house. Because it was my idea, after having a 12-room Victorian house and living in it for 7, 8 years, and realizing that I wanted it all done at one time, thinking that maybe I could have an old house that was new. Well, it sounds good and the theory's good, but it really still doesn't fall into place. we've since sold the house and now live in a real house like normal people, but have a lot of old junk in it. But come to find out, that house was moved to where it was in 1895. It used to sit over on Benton Street. And Dr. Miller came to us one time and he says, you know, I remember helping my dad. You know, my dad was a house mover, he said. He says, I can remember helping move that house over there. He said, we had logs and teams of horses. And I'm like, twice in its life, someone has saved this house. I mean, it's just inconceivable, because we tear into walls or something and say, why would anyone have done this? You know, and then I'd say, we put up a new wall or something, and I'd say, someday someone's gonna say, why in the world would anybody have done this? So, and I, loving antiques and loving old things, I guess old houses just have always captured me. I don't live in one now, and I say I'll never live in another one. But when Ann Milton's house became available, my husband said to me, he says, don't you just want to go look at it? I said, oh no. I said, I can't go look at it. He says, well, you know you don't want another old house. I said, oh, but I can't look at it. He said, but you know. I said, no, I can tell you that when I'm not in it. I said, but I wasn't in that house for 20 years, and I can tell you where every room is and what it's like, and I want it. But I'm going to tell you that I'm not going in it because I'm going to want it. So that's a little bit about me and Crete and my history and houses and this. Thank you.
Question.
Thank you, Georgiann.
Where your father had the first furniture shop,
Mhm.
where is that located?
Where the Crete Auto Sales is. He tore that house down. Well, actually, he burned it down. But where the Crete Auto Sales is, that was the first shop. Which, I mean, whose house? I mean, there's a name that house goes before Mazzarelli.
That's Alice, yeah.
The house where my dad had his first shop, where the Mazzarellis had their asparagus stuff. Who did that belong to first?
I think Myrick's.
Was that Myrick?
Myrick?
That was on Myrick, I think.
Well,
And I could remember when the Methodist parsonage was a little white house. And I think the Coolies lived there when they came to town.
well, what makes me think of the first is because sitting outside the shop was the old, what was considered to be the old carriage stone. And it's sitting over here in the vacant lot where we used to live. That was the carriage stone that was part of Crete. That was the carriage stone so you could step out of the carriage. And it sat in front of that house. And supposedly the story was that before Route 1 was bellied out right there, because Route 1 used to be up so much higher, but that's where that carriage stone sat, so that when they got out of their carriage, they could step right onto this it's a big piece of stone.
Where's that?
Oh, I'm sure.
We're missing that house, we missed it, the other book in our store.
Yeah, I'm sure we do. I mean, it would probably be swap shop, but it would be a picture of the house.
It had like tar paper panels on the outside.
Yeah.
Reddish.
Well, I mean, we were behind there the other day, and I mean, of course, Mrs. Mazzarelli, I mean, you know, this goes back to my childhood, I mean, she would sell bouquets of peonies, and rows of peonies, and all the asparagus. And we would go over and help her cut that stuff down. Well, now it's a forest back there. All these little scrub trees have grown up over the years, and it's like a forest. I said to my sister, I mean, it doesn't seem like that long ago that this was the peonies, the roses, and what has happened because there's so much shade, I mean, some of the peonies are still there, but they're just teeny weeny little things. I mean, they don't even bloom because there's no sun anymore. But every once in a while we get some wildflowers out of there, some phlox or something like that.
What about the stained glass windows that were in the Congregational Church?
Well, that was part of, they were supposed to be left. Most of the windows are still in there. It was the lamps, the windows, the pews, and the bell. Now the pews, when my father took all the pews apart, numbered them, took them all apart, and put them up in the loft over what was called the back wing. Now it's my understanding that some years later, when the present owners in particular got it, that they took the pews out and sold them. Now I don't know, because in fact there is still one there, and it's sitting out in front. I was there the other day and I'm looking at it and I'm like, it's one of the pews and it's just rotting out there. Because they're old box pews. They weren't pretty, they were useful, they were just square, very boxy, But the chandeliers were, it's a shame. Those chandeliers came from the Eagle Lake Church, were bought by the Congregational Church in like the 1890s and given to the Congregational Church by some of the members. And they should have stayed there. That's what, but I guess progress changes and things change, so. Well, I tell people, I say go to the church. To me, it's still a church. There's no belfry. No one knows it's a church but me,
It's too bad the belfry's gone.
Yeah, but early years, there was I don't know whether it was a public library or school library or what it was that was stored up in the belfry. And when my dad got it, to say that the building was bad is beyond the words, bad. The snowdrift in the middle of the floor kind of, hinted to things that were to be. But there had been so much water after all these fires that all these books, if you ever go into the foyer of the marketplace, think of this, we filled that up twice with the books that were up in the belfry. Wet books. And the smell of wet books, every time I walk in and I'm thinking, we filled this room, But that's just, neat old books, but they were wet.
We used to be in the women's club there for a while. Remember, every time the speaker would start, the old train would go by and would stop, and then about the time they get started, and of course at that time in the 40s, there were a lot of trains going by.
There still are
today.
We were close, we know.
Yeah,
Well,
and they had a beautiful chandelier.
Well, the church was moved
Yeah.
when the railroad went through. The church was moved to where it is. It sat closer to the tracks. Well, there weren't tracks there then, but when the railroad came
They
through,
moved it for the second set.
They moved it for the
the
second
second
set.
set.
Yeah, Ray Pietering researched that. My in-laws were very involved with the Congregational Church. And when Grandma passed away, she had all this records and stuff from the Congregational Church.
Yeah.
And some we gave to Winston look at, and there were some that we gave to Ray Pietering. And he diligently went through a lot of that stuff.
Yeah.
And he found correspondence between the Congregational Church and the railroad at that time. And the thing was, I guess it was just one set of tracks, and they wanted to put another set of tracks in.
Yeah.
And it would have been too close to the building. So they offered them $5 to just leave it as it was, or if they wanted to move it, they gave Congregational Church $50, and they moved it over, I forget what amount of feet it was, for $50.
It could use a new foundation, Dan, trust me.
My wife and I were married.
Yeah. Well, I have the clock that hung hanging in my kitchen. I have the clock that hung in the, back in the educational. And of course, this was out of the Congregational Church. I took it home for years. I I had it stripped and then I never did anything with it, but I just wasn't gonna leave it there. And the old bulletin board the same way. I mean, it was just those things that you just, you know. I mean, over the years, thinking about Crete, I mean, many a time my dad would come home and he'd get called into a house in town. And, you know, he'd say to the family, why don't you keep some of this stuff? You're gonna be sorry. You know, you're gonna be sorry. Some of this stuff, I mean, it's a trunk full of dolls or a trunk full of, you know, family memorabilia that doesn't really mean much to me. I mean, I'm gonna sell it to somebody who doesn't know anything about it. Why don't you keep it? And a lot of times they'd say, well, we'll save a couple things, but we really don't want to save much, you know. But that's how the times were, you know. And we still see it today. I mean, we go out on estate calls all the time, and sometimes the family will save absolutely everything, and then other times she'll go in and there is nothing out of that house that's been taken. Nobody in the family has come and taken anything out of the house. So I always feel real lucky to have the things that we have from our family. And I mean, our family got rid of a lot too. I don't want to tell you that they didn't. I mean, on the other hand, my husband had a great aunt who was the family saver on his side. And to say that they saved things, I mean, to say that our family saved was nothing compared to this one. I mean, we have letters that date back to the Revolutionary War on how they got burned out of their farm in New York and just how they saved everything. But I'd say to my husband, what are we going to do with 5 generations of wedding slippers? You know, what are we going to do with your great-great-grandmother's wedding cake top? You know, I mean, there is a saturation point in any family. And if you've ever, it's like trying to bring, and like this was like 2 houses full into mine. I mean, I got rid of a lot of even my things so that I could make room for this stuff. And I passed a lot even on to my kids, you know. But that's history.
One of the things I remember about your dad's station was prone to be broken in quite often. And he rigged up an intercom system. And at night he'd leave it open and he would, several times, he heard somebody in there and was able to either chase him away or catch him.
Well, as the story goes, my father was not a very good shot. I don't think the burglars ever knew that, but trust me on this one. Charlie Lawrence is building a lot of windows replaced over the years. The Kelling boy was in the other day, and he says, do you remember this story? And it was one I guess I hadn't heard for a long time. And he said, your dad hears someone breaking in, because especially toward the end of the war, or even after the war, my dad sold a lot of tires. He was really the biggest dealer on the south side of tires, because they were rationed and everything else. But he had a lot of tires, and tires were pretty valuable. And he said, your dad hears someone breaking in. He's got his gun, but he doesn't have any bullets for it. So he runs over to our house, gets shotgun shells. Gets shotgun shells from us, comes back, hits all of Charlie Lawrence's windows out. And hits the guy, because my mother's yelling at them through the intercom, scaring him, thinking someone else is in there. The guy jumps out the back window, goes around the block, but he left his car in front of the gas station, which was his big mistake. He comes around and just walking like he's, you know, seeing what's going on and go, what's going on? And they see that he's got a piece of glass in his arm with the piece that matches out of the back. He left a piece of skin in the back. So the Crete police came to the rescue again and arrested him.
I remember one night when he was running down the alley behind us, we were on Lincoln Street, yelling, and he shot a couple of times. Elmer says, oh, there's George on the red.
Have to remember also, George was a member of the volunteer fire department.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. But, and I mean, my parents were always involved in Crete. I'll always say, when I'm carrying a heavy piece of furniture up that little stairway, and I'll go, why couldn't they have like been in the banking business or something? It would have been so much easier to carry money or something. And then I'll go, but Crete didn't have a bank in those days, that's why.
Yes, but you enjoy this work.
Oh, I love what I do. And I love the people. I mean, being in the house that we grew up, it's like being home. And it's fun. I love it. And I love to buy, so it's a very safe place for me.
What about the telephone that your family donated that to the Historical
Well,
Society?
that came out of the Blim house.
Uh-huh.
Well, actually, I think he got it from the Meeslers. But it wasn't a Blim house. It was I don't know if it was the first or the second telephone switchboard in Crete. But when the Meeslers, going back a little ways, when Mrs. Meesler was getting rid of some stuff, she had called my dad, and my dad had always tried to buy that. And, I mean, he didn't want to sell it. It was never for sale. It was in the shop all of its life, all the time we had it. And people would, they'd come and they'd say, there's something I found that doesn't have a price tag on it. And you'd go, the switchboard is not for sale. And you'd hide it, you'd put it in places, but they'd always find it, and it was never for sale. But he liked Crete. I mean, this was his home as far as he was concerned. And that anything that he could save part of it, I guess that was a big thing to him. I have a little washstand that came out of the Meesler house, that is next to my couch. We sit there every day and look at it. So, I mean, a lot of things have memories,
Your daughter's in the business too, right?
Yes, I passed it on. I gave the disease to her. She has third generation on 5th Street also. She's in what we call Charlie Lawrence's old building. A lot of these places, I mean, they've changed hands 20 times, but you still call them what they were, when you grew up there. And now she has a little baby, and so we're telling her that he's got to grow up as the 4th generation in the business.
When you lived on the Joneses' house, on Exchange Street, was there an underground railroad in that house that they talked so much about?
Well, as the story goes, when we tore off, I mean, the cellar, the basement was literally a cellar, and it had a lot of different passageways. And it had like little rooms, I'm going to say, But you also understand that house was the back part of that house was the original house, the kitchen, and what would have been what I call the cellar underneath it, because the front part of the house was built on by Dr. Perry.
Yeah.
And the old house was moved next door, I think it's yellow now. Mm-hmm. That was the original old part of the house, the old front part of the house. And when Dr. Perry lived in the house, his wife wanted the big Victorian part, so like in 1880, 90, whatever, they built the big Victorian part on. But they left the kitchen, summer kitchen, that whole area. And that was where the old cellar was, which we excavated and made a new basement out of. Put a whole new foundation under it, because the foundation wasn't any good in the house.
So that's why our street is named Perry Street?
I think
by
so.
the doctor?
I think so. And upstairs, there's a back stairway in the house. And the back stairway in the house goes to what was called a servant's quarters or something else. And there were all these little cubby holes. I mean, all these little, And, I mean, our son lived in the house, and we had the house on the market, and you have to say, how do you tell people that it's a bedroom? I mean, you have to be you have to be able to duck a lot to get from the front part to the back. I mean, you could get there, but not easily. And we put heat up there and stuff, but I mean, it was just a really old part of the house.
Was that stairway the original stairway with the house, or?
Well,
It was so beautiful.
oh, the front stairway?
Yeah, going upstairs.
When the new part was built onto the house, yeah, that was the new part. That was when the old part was moved next door, I think they left that stairway, but then there's the back stairway. There's a back stairway that goes out of the dining room now.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
Like I said, I've known Georgiann, and we spent lots of time together since she was a little girl. The funeral home, the first time I went to the funeral home, I walked in, I saw